Welcome to number 6 of the step-by-step setup guide to Home Assistant. Today, we will discuss scripts and automations that are based on entities. We left off from the last video, having created 4 new input booleans and placed them on our dashboard to use for testing. We can toggle the input booleans to turn them on or off, sort of like virtual switches. Note the word toggle refers to a behavior and no longer refers to the name of the helper. The goal of this video is to use these input booleans to demonstrate using entities rather than devices in our scripts and automations. There are questions we frequently face anytime we add new entities to our Home Assistant setup. For these new input booleans, what possible states do these have? Are they tied to a device? What can they do? There are 2 places we are already familiar with that can answer some of these questions. First is the Devices and Services menu, where we could go look at the Integrations, Devices, and Entities tabs. To save time, I will tell you, helpers do not get grouped into a device. The second place to search for information is the Developer Tools States table. Here, we can see the current state. Clicking the icon will show the More Info pop-up. Can we control these? Yes. And the states table is updated with the new state. Furthermore, we can see that the state is text and not a number. This will be important. Our final question is, what can these do? To find out, we must check the documentation. A search for Home Assistant input boolean will result in this documentation page. The entire page is worth a read, but let's go directly to what do they do and how are they used. This brings us to services. A little background. Integrations, from a user's point of view, not only create devices and entities, but integrations also determine what the entities are able to do and which actions they can take. These functions are called services. Please note this has nothing to do with the Devices and Services menu. In that context, a service referred to information we get from the internet, like weather or email. Here, the word service has a different meaning. It is an action entities can perform. In essence, what an entity can do. The documentation shows the available services. When the time comes to perform one of these actions, the name for this is service call, or calling a service. To see a list of all the available services, click on Developer Tools, and at the top, click the Services tab. The drop-down will list every service available to you. There is a naming structure. The first word is the domain, which should match the domain of your entity. The second word is the action. Search for input boolean and note which services are available. Choose input boolean.turn-on. If your screen does not match mine, you may need to click Go to UI mode. Then choose a target input boolean and call the service. Next, check on the states table to actually see your state change. We are working directly with entities, and when we want to take an action, there is something to note about the order. To control entities, we must first decide on a service and then choose the entity. This is the reverse of working with devices, where we can pick the device first and then choose what we want it to do. With entities, the action is specified first, then specify the entity. Now, let's create a script based on entities. We will use our input booleans for this. Create a script that will turn on test 3 and test 4. In the sequence section, since we are working directly with entities, we must select the action first before the entity. So the action type is call service. In the service dropdown, select input boolean.turnOn. Then select our target entities, test3 and test4. Save the script. Create another script that will turn off test3 and test4. Then put these scripts on your testing dashboard and verify that they work. Next, let's look at entities in an automation. All automation triggers will only fire when an event occurs. An example of an event includes the very moment an entity changes state. We will use entity state changes for triggers, but just so you know, there are other types of triggers, such as a timer has finished event and the current time. Let's create a new automation. When test1 to on, then turn on test3 and test4. When using an entity as a trigger in your automations, you will have to select a trigger type of either state or numeric state. Use a trigger type of state if the state of the entity is a text string, like off-on, home, away, open, or closed. The trigger type of state is also used for numbers, where you will specify an exact number, such as when the temperature changes to 30 degrees. Numeric state is used for numbers that must cross a threshold, like temperature greater than 30 degrees. Numeric state allows Home Assistant to do some comparative math to find greater than or less than values. For this automation, input booleans use text for the state, so set the trigger type to state. Next, select the trigger entity, input boolean.test1. Under the To section, type in on. Use lowercase. Leave the attribute and the From fields blank. It may seem reasonable to enter something like from off to on, but we do not want to do that in this case, because what if the state is unavailable or unknown, such as after a reboot? Our desired behavior here is that we do not care what the old state was, only that as soon as there's any kind of state change to on, we want the automation to fire. Entering additional information in these fields will make the trigger more restrictive. On the other hand, we could leave all these fields blank. Then the automation would fire on all state change events. Next, complete the Actions section. And since we are working with entities, we have to call a service. Select the service input boolean.turnOn. Then select the target entities. Save the automation, place it on the dashboard, and test that it works. As soon as we manually turn on test1, then automatically test3 and test4 should turn to on. Next, let's make this automation more sophisticated by adding a condition. When test1 changes to on, if test2 is on, then turn on test3 and test4. As mentioned before, a trigger will only fire if there is an event, like a state change. However, a condition will only look at what the condition state is right now and decide if it should continue to the actions. If the situation is true, continue. If the situation is false, abort. The goal is we want this automation to abort if the state of test 2 is off. Let's go back and edit the automation to add this new condition. In the Conditions section, choose a condition type of state. The entity is input_boolean.test2. For the state, type in on. This means test 2 must already be on when this automation triggers. Click Save. Now to test this automation. I can turn on test 1, but if test 2 is off, it does nothing. Test 2 must be on when triggering test 1. If you have created other automations that use these same input booleans, make sure to disable any old automations so they do not interfere with your testing. Let's try a more difficult scenario. We would like to keep track of the number of times test 4 turns on. We do not care who or what caused it to turn on, just that it has turned on. To do this, create a new helper and choose Counter. Unlike most other helpers, the name for Counter is the same for both beginners and advanced users. Next, create an automation. When test 4 changes to on, increment the counter. Typically, when I use an unfamiliar element, like this new counter, I have a better experience if I read the documentation and check the states table. To save time, though, I will skip this step. Place the new automation and counter on the dashboard. We can see it increase the count if we control test 4 manually, and it increments if test 4 is turned on by an automation and by a script. A key point of this video is to show that automations and scripts can use entities not only as triggers but also to perform actions by calling services. Since a script is also an entity, it is possible to run scripts right from an automation with the service call script.turnOn. This means it is possible to put a list of actions directly in the automation or write them out separately in a script and then make the automation call the script entity. So when is it best to use scripts over automations? This is personal preference, but here are some ideas to consider. A script may be useful if you have a group of actions that several automations share. Write the actions just once in a script rather than duplicating them among several automations. Another thought, scripts are useful if you have a group of actions that you would like to have the option to run manually and automatically. Automations are harder to run from the dashboard if you want manual control for yourself or your household. Another consideration is that scripts have a cancel feature. Longer scripts with timers and delays can be canceled from the dashboard. Scripts are geared for human interaction. Automations aim to be fully hands-off. Canceling a running automation is possible, but the task is more involved. And finally, scripts may also be used in place of scenes. To create a new scene, you must physically turn on the target lights and adjust the settings, which is problematic if somebody is sleeping. Use a script instead, leave the light alone, and if needed, copy the settings from another light. Plus, scenes only control lights and switches and are limited. Scripts have access to all the service calls. This concludes today's video. Please join me next time where I will discuss backups and restoring Home Assistant.